Story 1. There is a quiet little lake hidden just a short walk from my house here in Parsonsfield, Maine. I have been fishing there ever since I moved to this area. The lake is tucked away from any roads or homes, offering perfect privacy. I could always count on having the whole place to myself. It became my tradition to leave my kayak leaned against a massive tree by the shore whenever I was not using it. The kayak is heavy enough that it would not tip over, even in a strong wind, and I kept it covered to prevent any critters from making it their home. It saved me the hassle of hauling it back and forth every time I wanted to head out onto the water. One warm summer evening, I had been out on the lake for about an hour. I had already caught a few decent-sized trout, which I had stored in my cooler. The sun was setting, and the last slivers of daylight were fading behind the dense line of trees. I was just about ready to paddle back when I noticed movement on the far edge of the lake. Squinting, I saw someone standing at the water's edge, tipping over what looked like a barrel. A dark liquid poured from it into the lake. It struck me that this person might be polluting the water. Without thinking, I called out, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The person froze, looked up at me, and then bolted into the woods, leaving the barrel, or what was left of it, still draining into the water. Even from where I was sitting, I could tell the liquid was a deep, dark red. It unsettled me. My gut told me it was something awful, though it was too dark to be completely sure of the color. Either way, I decided it was time to leave. I paddled back to my usual spot, feeling uneasy. Seeing someone pollute such a pristine place sickened me, and I decided I would report it to the Department of Environmental Protection as soon as I got home. After pulling my kayak onto shore, I covered it quickly, skipping my usual routine of propping it against the tree. As I was finishing up, I heard the sharp snap of a twig breaking nearby. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they step on a branch. My heart started pounding. I glanced around but saw nothing. Deciding it was better to be safe than sorry, I grabbed my gear and cooler and started making my way out of the woods as quickly as I could. The walk back to the road was short, but it felt much longer that night. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. When I got home, I rushed inside, locked the door behind me, and let out a shaky breath. After putting the trout in the fridge and rinsing off, I decided to heat up some leftovers for dinner. As the microwave hummed, there was a knock at my front door. Instantly, the fear I had felt earlier came flooding back. I froze. It was late, and I was not expecting anyone. My car was in the driveway, and the lights in the house were on, so whoever was outside knew I was home. The knocking came again, this time more insistent. Then, a man's voice called through the door, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I just want to explain myself." There was no way I was opening the door. The fact that he had followed me home made it clear that he was not someone I wanted to deal with. I shouted back, "Leave now, or I am calling the police." He responded in a calm voice, "Sir, please, I just want to talk." I repeated my warning, but he did not answer this time. Instead, I heard him knock on one of the windows. My heart was racing as I quickly locked every door and window in the house. Then, I called the police non-emergency line to report both the incident at the lake and the fact that this man had shown up at my home. That night, I tried to sleep, but I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around 2 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering downstairs. Grabbing my Glock from the closet, I moved quietly to the bedroom door. I could hear slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden stairs. My heart pounded as I aimed my gun toward the door, waiting. The knob turned, and the door creaked open. In the dim light, I could see the silhouette of a man stepping into the room. I flicked on the lamp and shouted, "Get on the ground now." The man raised his hands, but I noticed he was holding a small knife. I ordered him to drop it, but instead, he said calmly, "I am leaving," and turned to run. I shouted after him, but he bolted down the stairs and out the front door. When I got downstairs, I saw the broken window and realized he must have climbed through it to get in. Glass was scattered everywhere. I called 911, and within minutes, the police arrived. After explaining everything to the officers, I took them to the spot by the lake where I had seen the man with the barrel. But by then, the barrel was gone. The man had clearly come back to retrieve it. I described him as best as I could, a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline, glasses, a black flannel shirt, and black pants. The officers took my statement and left. That night, I stayed in the living room with my gun by my side, too shaken to sleep. The next morning, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. My brother Dale stayed with me for a few nights until I felt safe again. Looking back, I cannot help but wonder what was in that barrel. My gut tells me it was something horrific, maybe even human remains. Whatever it was, I am just grateful I trusted my instincts and did not open the door that night. Sometimes, your gut knows what your mind cannot explain. Story 2. Ever since I was a kid, fishing was a big deal in my family. The older men, my dad, my uncle, and even my grandpa when he was around, always made it their mission to take me out on the water every chance they got. They treated it like some kind of family tradition, like I was next in line to inherit the title of fishing expert. My dad, John, and his brother Matthew were the most serious about it. Our house was practically a shrine to fishing, with rods, tackle boxes, and fish mounts on the walls. You could walk in and know immediately that we were a family who spent more time on the water than on dry land. This story, though, is not mine. It belongs to my dad, and let me tell you, he's not an easy guy to scare. But when he talks about this particular trip, you can see something change in him, like it left a mark. He does not like telling this story, but every now and then, at a family barbecue or a holiday gathering, someone will convince him to recount it. Every time, it sends chills down my spine. It happened years ago. My dad, his brother Matthew, and their 3 friends, Rich, Jeff, and Monty, set out early one morning before the sun was even up. They were heading to a remote fishing spot they had scouted out, a hidden cove that took hours to reach by boat. It was the kind of place few people knew about, surrounded by dense woods and known for its abundance of bass and the occasional pike. Perfect for a long day of fishing. The morning started off great. The boat skimmed across the water, cutting through the mist that hovered just above the surface. The engine hummed, and the group joked and told stories as they made their way to the cove. By the time they anchored, the sun had risen, and the day stretched out before them, promising good fishing and even better company. Monty, who was the wild one of the group, cracked open a beer almost immediately, never mind that it was barely past sunrise. My dad always said Monty had a habit of taking things a little too far, and that day was no different. As the hours passed, they fished, laughed, and celebrated every catch. By the afternoon, they had a decent haul, and the only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface and the crumpling of empty beer cans. As the day wore on, a thick fog began to roll in. At first, it was just a light haze, but by dusk, it had swallowed the boat entirely. My dad said it was the kind of fog that made you feel like you were floating in a void. Rich, the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept muttering about how unnatural it seemed. Even he had never seen anything like it. Jeff and Monty, who were well on their way to being drunk, seemed unfazed, but the rest of the group grew uneasy. When it became clear the fog was not going to lift, Matthew suggested they try to navigate out of the cove and into open water, where visibility might be better. He started the engine and cautiously steered the boat, but the fog was so dense that they nearly ran aground. Frustrated, Matthew decided it was too risky to continue and dropped anchor again. They would have to spend the night on the boat. That's when my dad, Rich, and Jeff decided to go ashore to try to find a cell signal. My dad had some work calls he could not afford to miss, and none of them were comfortable leaving their families in the dark about their situation. Grabbing a couple of flashlights and the emergency flares, they hopped off the boat and waded to the shore. The forest was pitch black, with only their phone flashlights cutting through the darkness. The fog clung to the trees, making the woods feel claustrophobic. As they climbed uphill, hoping higher ground would give them better reception, they began to hear strange clicking noises. At first, it sounded like it was coming from ahead, but soon it seemed to be surrounding them. The sound was rhythmic but erratic, like someone tapping out a message meant only for the forest. It was not like any animal sound they had ever heard, and the realization that it was human-made sent a chill down their spines. Rich, ever the survivalist, whispered for them to turn off their flashlights. "Do not give away our position," he said, his voice tense. They stood there in the dark, hearts pounding, as the clicking abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick and oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the rustling. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. And then, out of nowhere, a guttural scream tore through the woods. My dad said it was the most primal, blood-curdling sound he had ever heard. Before they could react, the ground seemed to erupt with the sound of heavy footsteps charging toward them. Acting on instinct, my dad fired a flare in the direction of the noise. The flare lit up the forest in an eerie red glow, and for a split second, they saw them. A group of at least 10 people, dressed in strange, tribal-like clothing, some holding wooden spears. The sight was so surreal that my dad wondered if they had stumbled into some kind of nightmare. Jeff let out a scream and nearly tripped, but Rich yanked him upright, and the three of them bolted back toward the boat. Branches scratched their faces, roots threatened to trip them, but they ran as fast as their legs could carry them. They burst out of the tree line, yelling for Matthew to start the engine. The urgency in their voices left no room for hesitation. Matthew fired up the boat, and they sped away just as the figures emerged from the woods and onto the shore. Before the fog swallowed everything again, my dad fired another flare back toward the shoreline. In the red light, they saw the figures standing at the water's edge, motionless, watching them. There were more of them now, at least 15, and then the light faded, leaving them in darkness once more. The boat finally reached open water, where the fog was not as thick. My dad said he did not process what had happened for hours. They took turns keeping watch through the night, too shaken to sleep. When dawn finally broke, they made their way back to the marina in silence, the events of the night weighing heavily on them. Monty, of course, had slept through the entire ordeal and did not believe a word of it when they told him. But my dad swears by it, and so do Rich and Jeff. To this day, my dad cannot explain what they encountered in those woods, but he is certain of one thing. He never wants to go back. Story 3. Fishing has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. At almost 60 years old, I have been out on the water thousands of times, and there is no other way I would rather spend the rest of my days. My kids have grown up and moved away, and the house is quieter than it has ever been. You could hear a pin drop most days. Sometimes I miss the old days, tossing a football around with my boys in the backyard, but life has a way of moving on whether you are ready or not. Most of the time, I fish with old friends from college, but more often than not these days, I end up going out alone, like some sort of lone wolf. This was one of those days. I have not left upstate New York in over 15 years, and I do not see a reason to. The lakes around here are some of the best in the country, and I plan on making the most of them for as long as I can. It was mid-April, just after the ice melted and before May rolled around. For some reason, I decided to head out to a smaller, secluded lake I had never fished before. A nondescript spot in the middle of nowhere. I figured it would give me some peace and quiet. I left home an hour before sunrise, wanting to be out on the water as the first light broke through the horizon. When I got there, I unstrapped my kayak from the roof of my car and made my way to the water. As I paddled to the middle of the lake, the early morning colors began painting the sky. It felt like home, like there was nowhere else I would rather be. It was a little chilly, but I am used to it. My skin is like steel after all these years. I was gearing up for a day of fishing, planning to target largemouth bass near the weed beds along the edges. My setup was simple, a 6.5 foot medium-action spinning rod with 9-pound monofilament line and a wacky rig with a 4-inch rubber stick worm. My go-to for base. Just as I was about to start, something caught my eye across the lake. At first, I thought it might be another fisherman, but the movement was strange enough to make me curious. I reached into my bag and pulled out my binoculars, a tool I usually used for birdwatching. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. There were 3 figures on the shore, dressed in dark clothing with hoods pulled over their heads. They were digging. At first, I thought they were burying something, but as I kept watching, I realized it was the opposite. They were pulling items out of the ground, one after the other. I could not make out what they were holding, even with the binoculars, but the sight of them tossing the items into the lake sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong. A wave of fear washed over me. Who were these people? What were they doing? I thought about leaving it alone and paddling away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I waited until they disappeared into the woods and then slowly paddled over to the spot. By the time I reached the area, I was shaking. I started fishing, not for bass, but for whatever those people had thrown into the water. For nearly an hour, I came up empty. Then I remembered I had a depth finder in my car. Determined to figure out what was going on, I paddled back to shore, grabbed the depth finder, and returned to the spot. I scanned the lake bed, feeling around for anything solid. After a few minutes, I found something. It was metal, marking the spot in my mind. I switched my fishing rig to the largest hook I had. Slowly, I let the line down, my hands steady and focused. Years of fishing experience came into play as I worked to snag whatever was down there. Finally, I felt the line catch. When I reeled it in, my heart stopped. Hanging from the end of my line was a black 9mm handgun. My hands were trembling. I carefully pulled it into the kayak, making sure not to touch it directly, and paddled back to shore as fast as I could. Once I was back on land, I called the police. They launched an investigation and eventually recovered several other items from the lake. A keychain with a bunch of keys, a cloth bundle of old foreign coins, and a water-damaged locket with faded, illegible photos inside. I stayed to watch them search the lake. I needed to know what else was down there. The police assured me they would contact me if they connected these items to any crime, but I never heard back. A few days later, though, something strange happened. Late at night, I heard voices outside my house. Someone said, "That's the car." I know it. I stayed inside, peeking through the blinds as several people circled my yard. They never knocked or rang the bell, and eventually, they left. I called the police again, hoping this would reopen the investigation, but nothing came of it. To this day, I have more questions than answers. Why were those items buried in the first place? Why did they dig them up just to throw them into the lake? Was it a cover-up? Something else? All I know is that this was the strangest, most unsettling day I have ever experienced on the water, and I hope I never have another one like it.